The topic of this sixth lecture is other minds. The key question is a straightforward one. How do I know there are any minds other than my own? This question is at the heart of a certain form of skepticism known as solipsism. The solipsist is prepared to make no claim other than the facts of his own existence and mental life, satisfied that the only reality is that which is minted within the utterly private duchy of his own consciousness. The problem of other minds, then, is just the problem of answering the solipsist. Now, in one sense, this problem is cut from the same cloth as all fundamental problems in epistemology. At base, the problem of other minds is just part of the problem of how it is we are justified in claiming to know anything. Let us say, at least for the sake of argument, that I know that I have a mind owing to the direct and immediate access that I have to my own mental states. I might even say that the basis of this knowledge is not unlike the foundation of all my knowledge claims, namely, direct perception. By way of introspection, I am able to perceive, in a manner of speaking, the events and states and contents of my own mind. But here we then come face to face with the problem of other minds. It's plainly the case that I cannot perceive any mind other than my own. Of course, strictly speaking, we cannot perceive our own minds either, for to do so it would be necessary for the mind to be some sort of perceptible object. Let's just say, speaking loosely at this point, that I'm aware of certain thoughts and experiences and feelings as being my own, and that for convenience I say that these are part of my mental life. Thus I say that I am aware that I have a mind, at least in this loose sense. But I do not have direct awareness of the thoughts, experiences, and feelings of anyone else. I have no database, therefore, with which to justify my imputing mind to anyone but myself. Note, however, that even if I had access to such data, there would still be the problem of other minds if the access were not of the first-person variety. Let me illustrate the point with a thought experiment. Let us say that we have a television picture of events occurring inside the skull of Mrs. Smith, these being allegedly mental events. The apparatus is such that when the screen turns green, Mrs. Smith reports hearing sounds and seeing objects. Now, even if we had an arrangement such as this, the problem of other minds would persist. For all I would be able to say when the green light is on is that this signals certain verbal behavior on the part of Mrs. Smith. I would not know for certain whether she was conscious or aware, nor would I know just what the contents of her consciousness might be. For all I know, she might be a well-constructed robot with a tape recorder that's activated by green light. Well, let's add ever more sensitive equipment, such that in addition to the green light, there are various symbols displayed indicating certain stimuli which would cause me to have a pain, and that these are now delivered to Mrs. Smith. Yet other symbols arise, which, were they recorded from me, would be associated with my experiencing an itchy chin, or the sound of a barn owl, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Again, even with all this, I would be under no obligation to accept that there is actually another mind, a mind distinct from my own. All such data from Mrs. Smith could be no more than a kind of computer printout, providing a record of certain input-output relations. I could not be sure that Mrs. Smith has a mind, or that she is in some sort of mental state, or that she is experiencing coffee, pain, or anything at all. Our thought experiment permits us to see another side of the issue. Consider how such an apparatus might have been constructed in the first place. We would have some means by which to sample and measure accurately the events taking place in many regions within the brain. All this would be accomplished with a fully conscious subject. Computer programs would be written to keep track of the verbal reports of each subject and the states of the brain associated with each of those reports. With a large enough set of correlations, we could improve our ability to match a particular event in the brain with a particular subjective state as reported by a given subject. Now, all this having been done, we now have our colleague, Samantha, tied into the system. At first, Samantha was going to cancel the appointment. She told us she had been having some trouble with one of her teeth. Gamely, however, she has agreed to participate. It is under these conditions that the equipment reports not only that Samantha is conscious, but that she is in pain. Again, we might be willing to accept that she is conscious and in pain, but we must still admit that we have no direct knowledge of any of this. That I have an itch is known by me directly. That you have an itch is something I can only infer from certain behavior on your part, including verbal behavior. Well, one might wish to take a common sense position here and declare straight away that if I say I have a toothache, and Samantha says that she has a toothache, we know what each other means, and that's the end of it. But that things are not this simple is illustrated by a passage from Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Let me quote from that work. Quote, "You surely know what it is 5 o'clock here means. So you also know what it's 5 o'clock on the sun means. It means simply that it's the same time there as it is here when it's 5 o'clock, close quote. He's being whimsical. The point here is that persons using these words are possibly as far apart in the sense in which they're using the words as might be the conditions prevailing on Earth and on the surface of the sun. In the absence of a very careful analysis of the basis upon which such terms are used, there's simply no way of knowing whether the two persons are referring to anything at all, let alone to two versions of the same thing." I should stay with Wittgenstein for a moment and his famous beetle in the box. It's a way of illustrating the problem. Imagine a half dozen people, each holding a small box. Each person can see what is inside the box he is holding, but can't see inside any other box. Suppose when queried, each of them takes a peek and reports that what's inside his or her box is, quote, a beetle. Unless we are sure that all of the participants are members of the same language game, one of Wittgenstein's terms, we have no way of knowing what the utterance beetle refers to. One of the participants might be from a distant planet where the utterance beetle refers to a stone. Yet another participant might come from a linguistic community in which beetle is the term for empty. In all, then, it is insufficient, as regards the problem of other minds, to know no more than that two people are using the same words. Many might regard Wittgenstein's strictures here as overdrawn. As it happens, we have the same information regarding the linguistic conventions of those with whom we share such conversations as we do when we see how they're dressed, how they generally comport themselves, etc. All I should want to say at this point is that, however the problem of other minds is to be understood, it's surely not merely a linguistic problem. At base, I submit that the problem of other minds arises once we attach all of our knowledge claims to direct perception. As I shall try to show with the help of Thomas Reid, it is an evidentiary problem in the sense that it becomes problematical only when we use the wrong sort of evidence. To make this clear, let me begin with direct perception. If direct perception constitutes the only justification for claiming to know anything, then in fact whole realms of what we regard as the known become quite obscure. Within limits, I am confident that when I turn the ignition key on tomorrow morning, the engine in my automobile will start up. My confidence is based on the belief that the laws governing the internal combustion engine continue to be valid over time and were not suspended last night. Thus, if the car doesn't start tomorrow morning, I do not become skeptical about the persistence of the laws of the internal combustion engine. Rather, I arrange to have the car serviced. Nonetheless, I never directly perceive a law. In matters of this sort, my belief is entirely inferential. It's a generalization based on past experience. If I'm a scientist, however, my belief is based on something far more substantial than past experience. It's based on the developed conception of the lawfulness of nature itself. I can put this more grandly. It's based on the conviction that if laws such as those governing the internal combustion engine were not persistent over time, the very coherence of the cosmos would be dissolved. The scientific position is based here on whole clusters of abstract reasoning, little of it available at the level of direct perception. Indeed, it is based on certain abstract mathematical precepts which are forever beyond the reach of perception. Of course, referring to something like coherence of the cosmos seems to beg the very question at issue. Who says the cosmos is coherent? Is such a perspective not simply another of our prejudices? Is it not just one of an indefinitely large number of pictures that might be drawn to capture the nature of reality? Questions of this sort are at the very heart of a contemporary issue within philosophy of science, usually subsumed under the heading realism versus anti-realism. Do the laws of science express what is really the case in the cosmos, or are they merely shorthand summaries of experiences we've had under conditions of highly controlled observation? Do our scientific laws express reality in the full, most faithful sense? Well, our plate is full enough without my attempting to answer this question. Those who defend a realist position, however, would be inclined to say that the success of such extraordinary projects as the space program, which I mentioned in an earlier lecture, would be utterly inexplicable except on the assumption that the laws on which that program is based are true. Now, I bring this up in order to present one particular ground of justification for knowledge claims of any sort. It is the pragmatic ground. I hope not to be misunderstood here. The pragmatism I'm prepared to defend is not captured by such trendy expressions as, if it works, it must be true. I refer instead to a class of assumptions or dispositions, absent which the very conduct of life, including philosophical life, would become nearly impossible. My guide here, as I mentioned, is the 18th century Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid. My Oxford colleague, Anita Avramidis, in her excellent book on Other Minds, argues that Reid was surely among the first philosophers to recognize the problem of other minds in its modern form. A relentless critic of skepticism, Reid advanced common-sense arguments against the seemingly impregnable position of the skeptic. Consider this passage from Reid's work, An Inquiry into the Human Mind. Quote, "The skeptic asks me, why do you believe the existence of the external object which you perceive? This belief, sir, is none of my manufacture. It came from the mint of nature. It bears her image and superscription. And if it is not right, the fault is not mine. I even took it upon trust and without suspicion. Reason, says the skeptic, is the only judge of truth. And you ought to throw off every opinion and every belief that is not grounded on reason. Why, sir, should I believe the faculty of reason more than that of perception? They both came out of the same shop and were made by the same artist. And if he puts one piece of false ware into my hands, what should hinder him from putting another?" Close quote. Reid's rejoinder takes for granted that we do not enter the world with utterly blank slates by way of our psychological or mental resources. The animal kingdom displays numerous and diverse patterns of behavior that are instinctual and that protect and promote life long before the animals could possibly learn such behavior. The caterpillar crawling over countless leaves, says Reid, till reaching the one that's right for its own physiology, does so not with the knowledge of a scientist, but under the undeliberated guidance of a surer authority. Instinct and intuition are natural endowments in place to be supplemented by perception and learning. But if the rich resources of perception are to serve their own purposes, they must not be nullified by the philosophical pretensions of the skeptic. Now let's listen to Thomas Reid again on just this point. Quote, "No man seeks a reason for believing what he sees or feels, and if he did, it would be difficult to find one. But though he can give no reason for believing his senses, his belief remains as firm as if it were grounded on demonstration. Many eminent philosophers, thinking it unreasonable to believe when they could not show a reason, have labored to furnish us with reasons for believing our senses, but their reasons are very insufficient and will not bear examination. Other philosophers have shown very clearly the fallacy of these reasons, and have, as they imagine, discovered invincible reasons against this belief. But they have never been able either to shake it themselves or to convince others. The statesman continues to plod, the soldier to fight, and the merchant to export and import without being in the least moved by the demonstrations that have been offered of the non-existence of those things about which they are so seriously employed. And a man may as soon by reasoning pull the moon out of her orbit as destroy the belief of the objects of sense." Close quote. Let me now apply Reid's perspective to the problem of other minds. Of course we cannot directly perceive any other mind, any mind external to our own. We do, however, perceive the behavior of others. On Reid's understanding, the very possibility of any form of social interaction at all presupposes certain instinctual patterns of behavior, the meaning of which will be understood by members of that species. In fact, understood across species. As Reid says, the first time one sees a stern and fierce look, a contracted brow, a menacing posture, he concludes the person is inflamed with anger. Let me take a step back from this and briefly summarize Thomas Reid's position on language. Toward the end of the 17th century, John Locke gave added weight to the traditional view that words derive their meaning solely by use and by convention, such that all language is governed by social rules and local practices. According to Locke and many others, a pattern of sound becomes meaningful as speech when language users accept it as such. The object I'm speaking into is called a microphone, not because the pattern of sound microphone in any way matches the physical properties of the object itself. Rather, by convention, the English-speaking world has given objects of this kind the generic name microphone. The meaning of the word is nothing other than conventional agreements as to how it is to be used, or as to what it represents. Now, Reid was perhaps the first to recognize that this account simply will not work. For in order for there to be agreements or covenants or conventions of any kind at all, they must depend on some language that must be in place by which to establish and signal agreement. We cannot agree to call some object a microphone unless we have some means by which to signal our agreement. Reid distinguished between what he called natural language and the language I am now speaking, which he dubs artificial language. The term natural language refers to modes of expression that are naturally or instinctually endowed. These are in the form of grimaces, posture, intonation. Reid regards these as widely distributed in the animal kingdom and, in fact, functional across species. We readily recognize the difference between an angry dog and a friendly one. If there ever was to be cooperative behavior between and among human beings, there must have been some basis in the pre-linguistic world of primitive man by which persons could signal basic sentiments and desires. There must have been a natural language by which to record agreement. Only in this way could an artificial language be developed, which then, conventionally, would have terms come to represent specific things. Natural language, then, becomes a kind of scaffolding on which the artificial language might be grafted. As with other natural endowments, there is no rational justification or argument according to which the signs and symbols of a natural language are to be judged. They are not to be judged at all. They are to be used. And it is their role in actual practice that establishes their validity. Even with the intellectual bounty conferred by artificial language, our day-to-day affairs and communications are still surprisingly marked by the infusion of natural language. Anger is often accompanied by a rigidity of posture, an increase in the volume of one's voice. The joy we feel very often expresses itself in the form of smiles. Sadness, too, is revealed through characteristic facial expressions and body postures. Charles Darwin was attentive to these aspects of natural language and in fact systematically recorded how the emotions of animals, including human animals, are expressed facially, vocally, and posturally. In light of all this, it should be clear how Thomas Reid will deal with the problem of other minds. At the most primitive level, the behavior of creatures that at least look like ourselves comes to be the basis upon which we judge the conditions giving rise to that behavior. Where such creatures express themselves in a manner comparable to our own natural expressions of emotions and desires, we are led insensibly to the belief that they, too, have a mental life that includes just these emotions and desires. It's not that we're unable to adopt a skeptical position toward this. It is instead that were we to act on this skepticism, the possibility of significant interactions with other creatures would be reduced to a nullity. Nor is it the case that in adopting one or another position, we deliberate at the level of pragmatics. The position we take is not based on deliberation. It is based instead on the strongest of natural inclinations, absent which life within society would be virtually impossible. To the extent that Thomas Reid's argument is an argument from analogy, it faces serious philosophical and conceptual objections. One of these was developed years ago by Norman Malcolm. At base, the challenge goes like this. The analogical argument is inferential. It is in the form of a generalization from the relationship between my mental states and behavior to the mental states and behavior of another. But my mental states and behavior are confined solely to one person, and this affords no ground whatever for a generalization to any other, let alone to all others. I must say this does not seem to be a fatal objection, and it may be based on a confusion as to just what is being generalized. The generalization does not proceed from one mind to all other minds, but from a very large number of correlated mental states and behavioral expressions. In the course of one day, each one of us has thousands of such correlations as part of the basis upon which to ground our generalizations. So I'm inclined to think that Norman Malcolm's criticism, though interesting, is less than compelling. To the extent that Thomas Reid's analogical thesis seems to require a private language, it faces all of the difficulties that Wittgenstein brought to bear on the very notion of a private language. After all, that was the old beetle-in-a-box objection. But this criticism, too, fails to reach Reid's position, which, as it happens, is very close to Wittgenstein's own. The language Reid is referring to as a natural language, not the artificial language of aches and pains. Indeed, Reid's natural language matches up quite well with what Wittgenstein called natural expressions. We might say that both Reid and Wittgenstein are establishing the criteria according to which the judgments we make about the interior life of another are warranted. Certain natural expressions satisfy the relevant criteria and constitute a warrant for believing that someone else is happy or in pain or is angry. It's not that they say, "I'm in pain," it's that their behavior matches up in the right way with the behavior we are engaged in when we have that sensation. It should be clear that our recognition of other minds constitutes the basis of one of the most important ingredients of social life, which is empathy. Our conduct toward others and what we expect from them both depend to a very considerable extent on our ability to project ourselves into their situation, and vice versa. It is doubtful, however, that such an important foundation for relationships between and among living beings would be reserved solely to human beings. Some recent evidence suggests that mice are, of all things, empathic. I do wish that this interesting finding did not require the little creatures to be caged and pestered, but we can only attempt to solve one problem at a time. Well, what about this one? Scientists at McGill University performed a series of experiments in which cage mates were inflicted with one or another distressing or painful stimulation. For example, one of the mice had an abdominal injection of a weak acid, the effect being the repeated stretching and extension of their hind legs. Now, when a cage mate was put into the same cage, lo and behold, the cage mate, having been injected with nothing, displayed the same behavior. Moreover, when two injected mice were placed together inside a cylinder, they spent more time writhing than when they were injected alone. It is interesting that these effects took place only with pairs of mates who had lived together for at least a week. Now, I would not presume to conclude that findings of this sort establish a similarity between human and non-human forms of empathy. Nor, however, do I regard the human form of any characteristic to be the last word on that characteristic. What it takes to make it through a troubled and troubling world is obviously different for a mouse and a man. Sometimes in our enthusiasm for evolutionary ways of thinking, we tend to regard a dog as sort of unconsciously striving to become an ape who, in time and with comparably great effort, might become the mayor of San Diego. I jest, of course, but I do wish to make a serious point. Selection pressures operate quite differently on different species. Here again, it is a pragmatic standard that establishes what is likely to find its way into succeeding generations. What I would be prepared to conclude from research and critical reflection, at least tentatively, is that nature fits us out, all of us, mice included, with certain basic tendencies and dispositions. We are thereby able to adjust to certain significant environmental conditions without having to learn how to cope with everything. Just how nature goes about establishing these tendencies and dispositions is to be settled by those at a much higher pay grade than my own. Surely the easiest way to settle the problems that seem to be plaguing us is by simply refusing to grant any special status to consciousness at all. Let's see what happens once we insist that all that exists is just one or another kind of physical thing. This surely gets us out of the bind. All we have to do is embrace physicalism, which is our next port of call.